President Donald Trump's military campaign against Iran, voting to block a bipartisan resolution aiming to stop the air war and require that any hostilities against Iran be authorized by Congress. As voting continued, the tally in the 100-member chamber was 52 to 47 not to advance the war powers resolution. Susan, what more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, this was a resolution that was dead on arrival. First of all, because the Republicans have a majority. And second of all, because historically, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, lawmakers really don't like voting on these kind of resolutions because whatever they say will be on record forever and can be used against them at any time. You can think of Hillary Clinton, for example, when she authorized the Iraq invasion and how that turned out for her. It was hanging over her head like a dark cloud for years to come.
Hello and welcome, guys. Adam is here. So this has just happened, guys. Thousands of Americans have surrounded the Capitol demanding Congress cut off funding for the Iran war, and lawmakers are walking out of the building to stand with them. The power of the purse, the most fundamental constitutional authority Congress holds, is now the weapon being demanded. Chaotic and still, beautiful and terrifying, depending entirely on which side of the barricades you occupy.
And also because it was dead on arrival, not just because of the Republican majority, but because the Senate is also a majority Republican. And also when it comes to this War Resolutions Act, what's interesting is that all presidents since it was established, which was in 1973 after the Vietnam War, all presidents have opposed it. And presidents themselves, usually when they're in office, Republican or Democrat, they consider it to not be part of law. They go with the Constitution usually. And the president in this law as well has veto power. So let's just say it would have passed the House and the Senate, but the president could ultimately override it with a veto.
Susan, we know that the resolution would force a withdrawal of U.S. forces unless Congress formally authorizes the war. And since you've given us the update, as the resolution has failed to advance, does it now give the White House a freer hand to escalate its military approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Because under Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, the president is the commander in chief. And while the Constitution also said that Congress is the one who can declare war, the president can override that when the White House and the executive branch believes that there is an imminent danger. And that's what the Trump administration has been trying to argue in the past few days. So, it does give the president authority to continue with.
But the fire-consuming Capitol Hill right now is not limited to the protest movements outside its walls. Something equally explosive is happening within. Senior national security officials, people who were appointed by Donald Trump personally, who carry genuine MAGA credentials, who were supposed to be the ideological true believers staffing the inner sanctum of this administration, are resigning in protest and going public with detailed accounts of what they witnessed from inside the decision-making process. These are not career bureaucrats who predate Trump's arrival. These are his people, selected precisely because they were supposed to be loyal, and they are walking away anyway.
His operations in Iran, but it doesn't mean that the Senate and Capitol Hill in general don't have other tools in their toolbox. They will probably put forth other means and other resolutions where they will be voting on. And, some that don't want this war to continue will hope that can get through. But like I said, it's very unlikely. Remember, we are dealing with a majority, although very slim, Republican party right now.
Yes, Susan, now Democrats say that the president sidelined lawmakers, and on the other hand, Republicans argue that the commander-in-chief needs room to act. So with midterm politics already looming, how much are electoral calculations shaping the positions inside Congress right now?
Yeah, that's very important. And while everyone has their eyes on the midterm, I will be honest with you, this war has not hit mainstream yet, mainstream America. First of all, because gasoline prices have not been affected. Democrats want to make the argument that the longer this drags on, it's going to affect oil prices. But the issue right now is America is producing enough oil to offset very high oil prices.
They are holding press conferences and giving interviews and releasing statements that contradict the official narrative of why America went to war with Iran And every single one of those statements lands on Capitol Hill like an artillery shell. The political inferno consuming Washington right now is being fed from every conceivable direction simultaneously. Outside, the protest movement grows larger and louder with each passing day. Inside, the resignations accelerate, each departure triggering speculation about who might be next. In the courts, Trump has suffered a stinging 6-3 defeat at the Supreme Court that clipped his emergency powers in a ruling that legal scholars are still digesting. In the streets of all 50 states, the No Kings marches have transformed from sporadic demonstrations into a sustained nationwide movement with organizing infrastructure and clear demands.
And on the other hand, despite the fact that oil prices did jump significantly, they were at an all-time low before the war started, significantly lower, at least in the past few years. It was $60 a barrel. For example, before there was a fear that it would jump up to over $100 a barrel. That has not happened. It has not happened yet. And gas prices and American pocketbooks haven't been affected yet. But I will say that the White House time is of essence right now, because the longer this drags on, the more mainstream it becomes, the more questions the American public start asking. And especially with that tragedy of losing American forces, if more forces are lost, then that's going to affect the hearts and minds of the American public. And I will say that America, no matter how much authority the president has, America cannot sustain an operation or a war without the support of the American public, especially in a midterm year.
And now, on the campaign trail and in Democratic primaries across the country, impeach and remove Trump over the Iran war has become a litmus test issue, a threshold question that candidates must answer clearly and affirmatively if they want to survive their primaries. When a political demand moves from a protest chant to a primary litmus test, something fundamental has shifted in the political landscape. The demand has entered the mainstream. It has been absorbed into the electoral process. It is no longer the property of activists and organizers alone. It now belongs to the party infrastructure, to the candidates seeking office, to the voters who will decide those candidates' fates. That is precisely what has happened to the calls for Trump to resign or be removed from office over his decision to launch an unauthorized war against Iran. What began as Representative Al Green's impeachment resolution, which party leadership killed by a crushing margin of 344 to 79, has evolved through every subsequent near-miss vote into something far more potent. It moved through the bipartisan war powers resolutions that lost by only 7 votes in the House and 6 in the Senate. It built momentum through the accumulating legal consensus, through the Supreme Court's rejection of Trump's emergency authority claims, through the rupture with traditional allies, through Spain's decision to close its airspace to American military flights, through the Pentagon's staggering $200 billion supplemental funding request that came with no time frame and no exit strategy. And now it has arrived at a place where Democratic candidates are actively being measured on whether they support impeachment and removal as the appropriate constitutional response to a war launched without congressional authorization. This is not the progressive wing talking to itself. This is not a fringe demand from the activist left that can be safely ignored by party leadership. This is the accountability demand becoming the organizing principle of an electoral coalition that is building toward the midterm elections with increasing discipline and focus. And Joe Kent, Trump's own national counterterrorism chief, is the inside account that makes all of the outside pressure impossible to dismiss. Kent was not some anonymous bureaucrat whose name nobody recognized. He was a decorated Special Forces veteran with genuine national security credentials. He was MAGA-aligned, a loyalist who had run for Congress with Trump's endorsement. He was appointed by this administration to one of the most sensitive positions in the entire government, responsible for coordinating the nation's counterterrorism operations. And he resigned in protest anyway. What Kent said when he walked out the door was devastating precisely because it came from someone who had every reason to stay silent. Iran posed no imminent threat, he said publicly. The war was started due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. He said he had seen the intelligence, he understood the threat picture, and based on everything he knew, the decision to launch a military conflict was not justified by the facts. It was a political choice driven by external pressure, not a security necessity driven by genuine, imminent danger. Kent's resignation has been described as the most senior departure to date over the Iran war. That phrase, most senior to date, carries enormous weight because it implies something the administration desperately wants to deny. There have been others. Kent is merely the highest-profile official in a pattern of departures, a cascade of resignations from people who had access to the same intelligence Kent saw, who understood the decision-making process from the inside, and who concluded independently that what they witnessed did not justify what Trump did. When insiders leave and start talking publicly, they validate the outside arguments in a way those outside arguments can never validate themselves. The protesters surrounding the Capitol can say the war is illegal, and they are correct. The constitutional law community is virtually unanimous on this point. The lawmakers walking out of Congress to join them can say not one dime more, and they are correct. The power of the purse is the most fundamental check Congress possesses on executive overreach. The legal scholars at the Brennan Center and the ACLU, the analysts writing in Politico and the Georgetown International Affairs Journal, they can all say the war constitutes an impeachable abuse of office, and they are correct. But Kent says something fundamentally different from all of them because Kent carries a credential none of them possess. Kent says he was inside the room. Kent says he saw the raw intelligence with his own eyes. Kent says the imminent threat that is the only legal justification under domestic and international law for launching an unauthorized war simply did not exist. And Kent says the decision was made anyway, driven by political pressure from a foreign government and its domestic lobbying apparatus. That is the inside account colliding with the outside fire, and Capitol Hill is now surrounded by both. What we are witnessing right now is the simultaneous convergence of three distinct but mutually reinforcing fronts, each one powerful on its own but genuinely explosive when they operate together. The protest siege outside Congress represents the mass mobilization front, the visible, audible, undeniable expression of public outrage that lawmakers can see from their office windows and hear from the floor of the House and Senate. The resignation crisis inside the administration represents the insider defection front, the steady bleed of credentialed national security professionals who are abandoning the president and telling the world why, and the impeachment and removal argument migrating from legal analysis into electoral litmus test represents the institutionalization front, the process by which a political demand becomes embedded in the machinery of elections and cannot be ignored by anyone who wants to hold office. Each of these fronts alone would create significant political pressure. Operating together, they create something that the procedural tools available to House leadership cannot fully contain. Start with the protest front, because the Not One Dime More campaign represents something far more constitutionally sophisticated than generalized anti-war sentiment. The framing is deliberate and surgically precise. Every single word is doing analytical work. Not One Dime More invokes the power of the purse directly, the specific constitutional authority that Article 1, Section 9 grants to Congress and to Congress exclusively. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. The protesters are not merely opposing the war on moral grounds or questioning its strategic wisdom. They are demanding that Congress use its most fundamental and irreversible constitutional power, the power to control government spending, to end a war that the president launched without authorization and continues to wage without authorization. This is the most constitutionally powerful demand available to any opposition movement because it targets the precise mechanism that can actually stop the war regardless of what the president wants. We have documented extensively throughout our coverage how the positive congressional actions, the war powers resolutions, the impeachment articles, the withdrawal mandates, all face procedural obstacles that Speaker Johnson has repeatedly exploited to protect Trump from accountability. The whipping operations to cancel votes before they happen, the tabling motions that prevent measures from reaching the floor, the Rules Committee maneuvers that shape what can and cannot be considered, All of these tools are available to leadership when Congress is trying to do something actively, to pass a resolution, to invoke a statute, to move an article of impeachment through the committee process. But the funding cutoff is fundamentally different because it requires Congress to do nothing at all. The $200 billion supplemental funding request that Defense Secretary Hegseth presented to Congress came with no time frame attached. It requires Congress to act affirmatively to appropriate the money. If Congress simply declines to act, if enough members refuse to vote yes on the supplemental, or if the supplemental never even makes it to the floor because the political environment has made it too toxic to touch, the war runs out of money, not because Congress stopped the war through some dramatic legislative maneuver, but because Congress simply refused to fund it. The procedural obstacles Johnson uses to block positive action do not apply to inaction on an appropriations request. You cannot whip members into voting for something they are terrified to support. You cannot cancel a vote that never gets scheduled because leadership knows the votes are not there. The Not One Dime More protesters understand this dynamic with remarkable clarity. They are not asking Congress to pass a new law constraining Trump's war authority. They are asking Congress to refuse to write the check. That is a demand that requires only enough members to withhold their support, not enough members to overcome procedural hurdles and force something onto the floor. And the lawmakers who are physically leaving the Capitol building to stand with protesters, who are denouncing the conflict as a violation of both United States and international law in full view of cameras and constituents, are positioning themselves publicly to vote no on the supplemental when it eventually arrives. They are building the political architecture for the funding fight before the funding fight formally begins, creating a public record that makes voting yes exponentially more difficult when the moment of decision arrives. Now consider the resignation front, because Kent's departure as the most senior resignation to date signals something profound about the internal dynamics of the administration that extends well beyond the content of his specific public statement. Senior officials in any administration are constantly running a brutal cost-benefit calculation about when to stay and when to go. Staying inside provides influence. It allows you to moderate decisions from within, to provide alternative analysis, to slow bad ideas through bureaucratic friction, to be in the room when the options are being discussed. Leaving provides freedom. It allows you to speak publicly, to create an unassailable public record, to avoid personal association with decisions you believe are wrong or illegal or both. The threshold for leaving varies dramatically by individual temperament and circumstance, but it generally rises with seniority. More senior officials have more influence to lose by departing and more institutional and reputational investment in the administration's success. They have more reasons to convince themselves that staying is the right call, that their presence makes a difference, that leaving would be an abdication of responsibility. When senior officials start leaving anyway, when the internal calculation shifts from staying provides more influence than leaving to, leaving is necessary to avoid being personally implicated in something I cannot defend. It signals that the internal situation has deteriorated past the point where bureaucratic friction can meaningfully moderate it. Kent did not leave because he thought he could accomplish more from the outside. He left because he concluded that staying meant allowing his name and his reputation to be permanently associated with a decision he believes was made on false pretenses for improper reasons. He chose the freedom to speak over the influence of staying, and that choice tells every other official still inside the administration something they cannot unhear. The label most senior to date implies that others preceded him at lower levels. A pattern of departures from officials who had intelligence access and policy proximity to the Iran war decision, each one an individual human being running the same terrible calculation and concluding that the cost of association now exceeds the benefit of influence. When those calculations start cascading, when the most senior official yet concludes that the threshold has been definitively crossed, it creates a signal that reverberates through every remaining official still inside the administration. The cascade may continue. It may accelerate. Who else is running the same calculation right now? Who else is sitting in their office, staring at the wall, wondering whether their continued presence inside the administration constitutes complicity in something they know is wrong? The administration cannot answer that question publicly without drawing attention to it. They cannot reassure remaining officials that the situation is stable without implicitly acknowledging that stability is a genuine concern. Every statement designed to minimize Kent's departure, to dismiss him as a disgruntled former employee, to question his access or his interpretation, only generates another news cycle about what he said and why he said it. The resignation creates corrosive uncertainty inside the administration at precisely the moment when maximum external pressure is being applied from the protest front and the electoral front simultaneously. Now consider the electoral litmus test front, because this is the development that fundamentally changes the medium-term political calculus. When impeach and remove Trump over the Iran war becomes a litmus test in Democratic primaries, it means the accountability demand has been institutionalized within the electoral process itself. It is no longer sufficient for Democratic candidates to say the war is wrong, or that Trump overstepped his authority, or that Congress should carefully consider its constitutional options. The primary electorate is now measuring candidates on a binary question. Do you explicitly support impeachment and removal as the appropriate constitutional response to an unauthorized war, yes or no? That binary question is the most clarifying possible political test because it admits absolutely no hedging. There is no room for nuance, no space to express concern while avoiding commitment, no way to signal sympathy with the goal while distancing yourself from the mechanism. The candidates who answer yes are committing themselves to a specific, concrete legislative agenda that will take effect the moment they are elected or re-elected. They are telling primary voters in unambiguous terms that if they are in Congress, they will vote for impeachment articles, they will vote for war powers resolutions, they will vote against the supplemental funding request. They are making promises that can be measured against their subsequent voting records with perfect clarity. The primary process is now actively building an electoral mandate for the accountability agenda in districts where Democrats are either competitive or dominant. This matters enormously for the Republican members who are 7 votes away from flipping on the House war powers calculation, because competitive purple districts do not exist in a vacuum. They have Democratic primaries that produce general election candidates, and those general election candidates will run on the positions they staked out during the primary campaign. If the Democratic candidate in a competitive purple district has explicitly campaigned on impeach and remove, the Republican incumbent in that same district has to respond, and the Republican incumbent's voting record, the 219 to 212 vote that protected Trump's war authority, the vote against the bipartisan withdrawal resolution, the votes against every war powers measure that came to the floor, that record becomes the attack line in the general election. The electoral pressure does not operate on the same compressed timeline as the floor votes that Johnson is managing week to week. Primary results take months to materialize fully. General elections are further still on the horizon. But the institutionalization of the accountability demand in the electoral process means the political cost of protecting Trump's unilateral war authority has a compounding timeline. It gets more expensive with each electoral cycle that passes. With each month, the war continues unresolved and unauthorized, with each vote that a member must defend in a town hall or a debate or a campaign advertisement. Now examine what the convergence of all 3 fronts produces that none of them can produce operating independently. The protest front alone generates significant political pressure, but it can be managed through the standard toolkit that political leaders have always used against mass movements. Dismiss it as partisan opposition. Frame the protesters as a fringe element that does not represent mainstream opinion. Rely on the procedural protections of canceled votes and tabling motions to prevent the pressure from translating into legislative outcomes. Johnson has managed the protest front successfully enough, at least so far, that it has not yet moved the 7 House members whose votes would change the war powers calculation. The resignation front alone generates damaging news cycles and credibility problems, but it can also be managed through the familiar playbook of character attacks and strategic dismissal. Kent can be portrayed as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. His statements can be challenged by questioning his access to specific intelligence or his interpretation of what he saw. A standard administration response to departing officials can minimize the damage, contain the story, and move on. The electoral litmus test front alone generates medium-term pressure, but it is temporally distant enough that members facing re-election campaigns have time to calculate whether the political environment might shift before they actually face voters. They can wait and see, hope that something changes, bet that the public's attention will wander before Election Day arrives. But all three fronts operating simultaneously, that is something qualitatively different. Crowds surrounding the Capitol building demanding not one dime more, the most senior resignation yet from inside the administration, saying publicly and on the record that there was no imminent threat and that lobby pressure drove the decision. The accountability demand being systematically institutionalized as a primary litmus test that will shape candidate selection across the country. Each front reinforces the others in a feedback loop that amplifies the political impact of every individual development. The protest crowds validate the electoral litmus test, giving primary candidates demanding impeachment concrete visual evidence of genuine constituent demand. The Kent resignation validates the protest crowds, providing the inside account that gives the not one dime more argument its most powerful and unassailable factual foundation. The electoral litmus test validates the resignations, making Kent's departure more politically significant precisely because the accountability demand it supports is now being encoded into the primary process in district after district. Each front makes the other fronts more credible, more visible, more politically potent than they would be in isolation. And all three fronts converge simultaneously on the same target, those 7 House members and those 16 Senate Republicans whose votes would change the constitutional math that has so far protected Trump from every accountability mechanism Congress possesses. Those members are watching the crowds outside the very building where they work. They can see the signs and hear the chants from their office windows. They are reading Kent's resignation statement and understanding that his inside account makes their continued support for the war harder to justify with each passing day. They are watching Democratic primary candidates in districts uncomfortably close to their own run explicitly on impeach and remove, knowing that those candidates will soon be their general election opponents wielding their voting records as weapons. They are calculating in real time whether the political environment in their specific districts has finally moved past the threshold where the cost of protecting Trump's war authority exceeds the cost of breaking with leadership and voting for withdrawal. Johnson can cancel floor votes. He can whip members on recorded roll calls. He can manage the procedural space inside the House with the precision of someone who has spent decades learning every lever and every trapdoor. But he cannot cancel the crowds outside the building. He cannot whip the primary dynamics building in his members' home districts. He cannot manage the political space outside the Capitol, and that political space is currently engulfed in flames. The protesters are at the doors, their signs held high, their demands unmistakable. The most senior resignation yet is part of the permanent public record, a statement from inside the room that the war was built on false pretenses. The electoral process is institutionalizing the accountability demand as a litmus test that will follow every Republican incumbent who voted to protect Trump's war authority directly into their re-election campaigns. Trump finds himself trapped between a furious anti-war public that has surrounded the citadel of American democracy and a war he has insisted is legal and necessary and fully under control. His own counterterrorism chief, the man he appointed to keep the nation safe, says it was none of those things. The crowds outside the Capitol say they will not fund it for one more day, and the candidates running in primaries across America say that removal from office is the only constitutionally appropriate answer. The building may not be literally burning. The marble is not cracking from heat, and the columns are not engulfed in actual flames. But the politics inside that building are on fire, and the fire is coming from every direction simultaneously. There is no extinguisher large enough to put it out, and no procedural maneuver clever enough to escape the heat.